Conservatives are constantly making comparisons about Antifa to fascism, and Antifa does the same for conservatives, with their support of Donald Trump. So I thought that for today's video, I would attempt to look at each political movement and determine which truly resembles fascism more. For this video, I decided to use the 14 characteristics of fascism laid out by political scientist Dr. Lawrence Britt, who takes a look at Pinochet, Sukarno, Hitler, Francisco, and Mussolini to determine what makes a nation fascist. So if you don't like the criteria I'm using, take it up with him. This is the most academic criteria for fascism I could find. So let's begin. Number 1, powerful and continuing nationalism. The article states, fascist regimes tend to make constant use of patriotic mottos, slogans, symbols, songs, and other paraphernalia. Flags are seen everywhere, as are flag symbols on clothing and in public displays. This describes conservatives to a T. It is extremely common for them to symbol worship. They are typically the ones who wear the American flag, the blue line alteration of the American flag, the MAGA hat, you name it. There's probably many more of them.
The U.S. flag, it is the greatest symbol of freedom this world has ever seen, and that's not an exaggeration. And therefore, one of the most execrable acts anyone on our soil can do is disrespect it. I mean, that's why Colin Kaepernick, that entire affair infuriated so many Americans. You are disrespecting our country to its core when you disrespect that flag.
Back up! Back up!
Number 2, disdain for the recognition of human rights. Because of fear of enemies and the need for security, the people in fascist regimes are persuaded that human rights can be ignored in certain cases because of need. The people tend to look the other way, or even approve of torture, summary executions, assassinations, long-term incarcerations of prisoners, etc. The most obvious example of this is their indifference towards child detention centers. Most Republicans, 62%, say they approve of the treatment of undocumented immigrants by the U.S. government after crossing the U.S.-Mexico border. 31% of Republicans believe that Central American refugees shouldn't be able to seek asylum. Conservatives also support warmongering. 61% of Republicans supported military action in Iraq, the war that killed over 200,000 innocent people, most likely way more. And this is in 2018, for some reason. It actually gained support since 2014, where it was only supported by 52%, which is just abysmal. Even Hillary Clinton says that the Iraq war was bad at this point. 57% of Republicans support the bombing in Libya, a nation that didn't attack us and easily had the best quality of life in Africa. In 2015, it was found that 30% of Trump supporters would support the bombing of Agrabah, the fictional city from Aladdin. They also typically detest the Black Lives Matter movement, with 52% of Republicans opposing it, and are usually the ones who play devil's advocate for police brutality as long as they possibly can. And as we will later see, have brutally taken it upon themselves to repress black voters in an attempt to suppress the Democratic vote, all while actively signing billion-dollar weapons deals with Saudi Arabia, who was using said weaponry to practice genocide in Yemen. Hell, Nixon and George H.W. Bush both ramped up the drug war considerably to disproportionately target black people, Hispanics, and poor white people, because it was thought that drug users were more likely to vote left, and it was thought that people of color did drugs at a higher rate. Number 3, identification of enemies, scapegoats as a unifying cause. This is a textbook conservative move. Communism, socialism, Islam, Barack Obama.
I must speak to you tonight about a mounting danger in Central America that threatens the security of the United States. This danger will not go away. It will grow worse, much worse, if we fail to take action now. I'm speaking of Nicaragua, a Soviet ally on the American mainland, only 2 hours flying time from our own borders.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade.
And this admitted communist that just won the primary in New York, she's a communist who preaches race war, class war.
I remember the Cold War. I have an attitude towards Castro. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won the Cold War, there would have been executions in Central Park, and I might have been one of the ones getting executed.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Conservatives statistically have brains with negativity bias and are more reactive to fear. It's literally how their brain works. Number 4, supremacy of the military. Even when there are widespread domestic problems, the military is given a disproportionate amount of government funding, and the domestic agenda is neglected. Soldiers and military service are glamorized. Conservative politicians have voted to raise the military budget for decades and have continuously supported these same politicians while refusing to do Medicare for all or even the most basic welfare reform. Even if 1/6 of American households struggle with food scarcity and our infrastructure is crumbling right before our very eyes, they still manage to increase military spending for 5 years in a row, scrape together enough to put a shitload of unused tanks in the middle of a Nevada desert, and pay $1,280 per coffee mug for the Air Force that they could have easily just 3D printed for, what, $5? Number 5, rampant sexism, homophobia, transphobia. From the article, the governments of fascist nations tend to be almost exclusively male-dominated. Under fascist regimes, traditional gender roles are made more rigid. Opposition to abortion is high, as is homophobia and anti-gay legislation and national policy. I don't even have to say anything for this one. Conservatives just 5 years ago, when gay marriage was legalized, were rabidly anti-gay, and many still are, with 56% of conservative Republicans disagreeing with gay marriage, and they're almost entirely transphobic. While most of them rhetorically believe in the idea of equality between sexes, they ultimately do nothing to support equality bills or ending the gender pay gap. Conservative politicians have conducted draconian laws to limit reproductive rights while simultaneously doing very little to teach proactive sex ed. Number 6, controlled mass media. Sometimes media is directly controlled by the government, but in other cases the media is indirectly controlled by government regulation or sympathetic media spokespeople and executives. Censorship, especially in wartime, is very common, which I don't think really fits modern conservatives, believe it or not. It is undeniable that the U.S. has went on a large propaganda campaign to suppress independent media and make up blatant lies about enemy countries. But this is more a reflection of the system itself and not really modern conservatives. And both parties really do it. But if you disagree with me, go ahead and count it. Number 7, obsession with national security. From the article, fear is used as a motivational tool by the government over the masses. When you take the fact that they believe in the supremacy of the military, along with constant scapegoating and creating enemies, this becomes the logical conclusion. Number 8, religion and government are intertwined. Have I already talked about the crude abortion bills in the South being proposed by conservative politicians? One bill passed makes it a Class A felony to perform an abortion with a 10 to 99-year jail sentence for doctors. Oh, wow. Although it was struck down, what's scarier is the idea that they're most likely writing said laws knowing that they'll be struck down in the Supreme Court, and they're just doing this to please their anti-woman supporters. 80% of Republicans in 2014 believe that prayers should be spoken aloud during classroom hours in school. 67% of Republicans and Republican-leaning people say that the Bible should have some sort of influence in our lawmaking process, and when asked, when the Bible and the will of the people conflict, which should have more influence in U.S. laws, 41% of Republicans and Republican-leaning people said that the Bible should be chosen over the will of the people. Points 9 and 10. Corporate power is protected and labor power is suppressed. I combine these two, because they're essentially the same, more or less. Any leftists can see that both parties do these, but do conservatives support the maintenance of corporatism and suppress labor power? From the Pew Research Center. Among Republicans, fewer than half, 44%, say they have a favorable opinion of labor unions. On the other hand, 7 in 10 Republicans express a positive opinion of business corporations. 64% of Republicans believe taxes should be lowered or kept the same for corporations and high incomes as of 2017. 57% of Republicans oppose basic minimum wage increase, according to Pew Research. The appeal to Trump in the eyes of many Republicans was the fact that he was a businessman. They knowingly voted for a corporate billionaire who literally has Goldman Sachs executives writing tax codes for him and do absolutely nothing to oppose it. But what about labor suppression? The southern states have some of the worst labor laws in the entire U.S., and they also happen to be the poorest states, FYI. And it's more than just rhetoric or local laws. In 2017, House Republicans attempted to pass a national right to work law, which would have devastated unions, essentially making them toothless. Number 11. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Conservatives literally call any scientific or academic field which doesn't agree with them brainwashed liberal elites. Take something as simple as evolution, for example. The latest poll I could find on the subject, 2015, has only 37% of Republicans believing in evolution. Almost 2/3 do not believe in evolution. They frequently deny climate change to the point where Trump called it a conspiracy started by the Chinese government. By the way, Trump also believes the vaccines cause autism. And if you think it's just Trump and not his followers, 44% of Republicans don't think that climate change is man-made. Anyone with a degree that wasn't cut out from the back of a cereal box is usually called a Marxist or something outlandish, which is very fitting because they think Nazis were socialists, a belief which isn't shared by literally any historian or political scientist worth his degree. They also have this weird fixation against modern art, which is also very fascist, isn't it?
But something happened on the way to the 20th century. The profound, the inspiring, and the beautiful were replaced by the new, the different, and the ugly. Today, the silly, the pointless, and the purely offensive are held up as the best of modern art.
Hey, I just checked, and modern art is still a pretentious, meaningless, nihilistic shit show.
Fascists usually complain about the degeneracy of modernity. Number 12. Obsession with crime and punishment. Under fascist regimes, the police are given almost limitless power to enforce laws. The people are often willing to overlook police abuses and even forgo civil liberties in the name of patriotism. There's often a national police force with virtually unlimited power in fascist nations. Whenever you hear about a black person getting shot by the police, you'll inevitably see some boomer with a MAGA hat in the comments saying that he deserved it, or that we need to see the whole video to decide the truth. They're also the biggest supporters of the ICE detention centers, where parents are routinely separated from their children, never to be seen again. Their only justification? The parents committed a crime. Number 13. Rampant cronyism and corruption. Fascist regimes almost always are governed by groups of friends and associates who appoint each other to government positions and use government power and authority to protect their friends from accountability. Do you know why Hillary never got prosecuted when Trump came to power? Because it was all just political theater. Ultimately, those in power have a way of protecting others in power, even when they're from completely different parties. George H.W. Bush pardoned several people involved in the Iran-Contra affair, he himself being involved with it extensively. President Ford ultimately pardoned Nixon after Watergate, one of the most criminal domestic scandals a president has actually pulled off within the U.S. Trump has pardoned multiple war criminals, and the truth is, very rarely will you see anybody in government going to jail, and when you do, it's for a sentence that isn't nearly as long or strict as a regular person. Why is it that Trump never drained the swamp? Because he is the swamp. He's probably known most of these people for years, and this is all just political theater. Number 14. Fraudulent elections. Elections are purely a sham to legitimate the status quo in the U.S. and basically any country on earth. We can see this with the 2016 election and the 2020 Democratic primaries. But the Republicans regularly do similar things as well. They disproportionately benefit from the broken electoral college system where rural, typically conservative states are disproportionately given more votes per capita. Trump won by 2.9 million votes in 2016, and it's estimated that a candidate could potentially win the election even if they lost the popular vote by as much as 6 percentage points, or about 8.5 million votes using numbers from the 2016 election. Republicans regularly gerrymander borders to make elections as less democratic and as secure for them as humanly possible. In 2011, Republicans redrew the districts in Wisconsin. In the 2012 elections, Democratic legislative candidates received 51.4% of the popular vote, but Republicans won 66 of the 99 counties. But Republicans won 66 of the 99 districts, up from 55. The number of swing districts dropped from 24 to 13. As the Rolling Stones put it, it's practically a foolproof system. No matter what happened nationally, Republicans would maintain control of state politics. And Wisconsin isn't the only state. This happens nationally and is committed by both the Democratic Party and Republican Party. Since 2010, 23 states have introduced voter ID laws, all of which disproportionately affect Democratic candidates. On top of this, the Republican Party likes to use racist, Jim Crow-esque laws to repress black voters, people who are statistically more likely to vote Democrat, from the Rolling Stones. After the legislature passed the law in May 2011, a federal court found that 9% of registered voters in Wisconsin did not have the required forms of ID. Black voters who overwhelmingly supported Democrats in Wisconsin were 50% more likely than whites to lack such IDs. According to the Brennan Center for Justice, up to 11% of Americans do not possess government-issued IDs, including 25% of African American voters. And if you think that this is to stop voter fraud, the article continues, voter fraud is a very small problem in Wisconsin and nationally. According to one major study from 2000 to 2014, there were only 31 cases of voter impersonation out of more than 1 billion votes casted. Compared to 2012 elections, 2016 elections saw a 3.3 drop in voter turnout in Wisconsin. Black voter turnout decreased by 19%, and if you think that it's because 2012 was for Obama, a black person, and 2016 was for Hillary, a study by the University of Wisconsin determined that 1 in 10 non-voters said that they were deterred by the state's ID laws, 10% of voters overall. And this happens all over the country. It's not just Wisconsin. They did it in North Carolina too. So what about Antifa? Well, to begin, Antifa isn't a defined political ideology. It's an extremely loose, decentralized association of people who generally believe that fascism needs to be eliminated. While Republicans as a group are much more complicated because their goal is putting Republicans in office, which accounts for dozens and dozens of policy decisions, Antifa acts much more simply. They do not like fascists, so they beat the crap out of them. Because there is no ideological similarities between the people who associate with Antifa, their one and only connection is, well, being against fascism. And anti-fascism attracts people from all over the political compass. If you are a conservative who fundamentally believes that Nazism shouldn't exist and want to eliminate them via force, you could also be Antifa. So Antifa, as an organization, if you could even call it that, doesn't really meet any of these qualities. Antifa don't believe in overt nationalism. They don't hold disdain for human rights. They certainly identify fascists as an enemy for a unifying cause. They don't advocate for supremacy of the military. They don't advocate for rampant sexism. Many of Antifa are in the LGBT community because fascists threaten their very existence. They most certainly don't control mainstream media. The only obsession they have with national security is making sure it doesn't become a dictatorship. Can you call that fascist? They don't advocate for religion being in government, or to protect corporate power, or to suppress labor power, and they don't hold any disdain for the arts or intellectuals, or anything else on this list. Because at the end of the day, Antifa simply doesn't want fascism, and that is the only unifying cause of Antifa. So right away we see the conservatives in the United States hold 13 of the 14 characteristics of fascism, maybe 14 out of 14 if you don't agree with me on them controlling mainstream media. While Antifa debatably has like 2 of the characteristics. So who's the real fascist here, I ask you? So what does all this mean? Are conservatives fascist? I truly don't know. The purpose of this video was to show the criteria for fascism, and I really don't know. Maybe highlight some sort of hypocrisy in modern conservatism. However, as I like to discuss in a follow-up to this video, the Overton window is shifting more and more to right authoritarianism. The logical gap that it takes to go from conservative to Nazi is smaller than it has ever been than at this moment in history. And it's only going to get worse as the contradictions within capitalism begin to exaggerate. This is only another reason why the radical left has to organize in order to protect itself.